and, just educate us around what that means and where is that actually going in the 21st century.
Children who are growing up in families where the parents themselves weren't well educated versus children who are growing up in houses where people have, master's degrees and PhDs. Like if I start school at say age 4, the learning gap is already like 1 or 2 years. And so particularly for like the poorest kids, if you don't catch that up quickly, then they just sort of fall further and further behind. You think about what banks look like in the 1960s and then what banks look like today. A lot of schools in 2022, if you walk into a classroom, it kind of looks like it did in 1960. One part of this, which I think is interesting, is also to say that those million minutes aren't equally important. And in particular, the first 150,000 are critical because they lay the foundation. And so a child who gets a really good foundation during their first 2 or 3 years at school, so, they can read well, they've been socialized into how to behave at school, they have some good foundations in mathematics in particular, they're probably going to do reasonably well throughout the rest of their schooling, even if they end up having some bad teachers along the way, or essentially bad, ineffective teachers along the way, or end up going to a not so good secondary school or something like this. And you can actually go back and there's fascinating studies which show that if you look at the, children who are growing up in families where the parents themselves weren't well educated versus children who are growing up in houses where people have, master's degrees and PhDs. Like if I start school at say age 4, the learning gap is already like 1 or 2 years. And so particularly for like the poorest kids, if you don't catch that up quickly, then they just sort of fall further and further behind. So one thing about those million minutes is that the first ones are actually the most important, and particularly establishing a foundation of those. And probably the most important thing is reading, because if you can't read well by about age 8, you're not going to be able to perform well in almost any other subject, because obviously reading is critical to every aspect of education. So in particular, getting that good literacy at the beginning, it is really critical.
That is so, so important because, between, the subconscious mind at that age takes all the information and it's like absorbing it. And that's the practice in the subconscious mind. And the first, let's say a couple of years, beginning of the, between 4 and let's say 10 years old, it's so important to have those basic foundations in schools so that the subconscious mind is more rewired based on the right fundamentals, reading, thinking, solving problems, knowing how to guide yourself so that you don't have to be always guided in the journey called life or school, which is very fascinating. And I think it's so important to understand that. So the third, thing that we know is that most school systems have struggled to improve, but a few prove that, substantial sustained improvement or over time is possible. So what do you mean by that? The third thing about, most school systems have struggled to improve, and why have they struggled?
So suddenly, if you look at places like Singapore, which has had a phenomenal trajectory, what you see is, firstly, they've been focused on the right things. So they've been very focused on teachers, pedagogy, teaching, curriculum, very effective school leadership, and so on. But then there's also a few features of the system that are making it work well. So they've had very good people in charge of the system at the highest levels who have been very focused for a long time on what the research tells them. They've been very good at implementation. Obviously, it helps that Singapore is very small, but they've been very consistent at choosing a policy and then making sure that it's being implemented effectively, measuring the effects of that, and so on. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about Singapore is they have a very low tolerance for failure. So if they find a school that isn't performing, if you have a school that's not performing in many school systems, it can sit there and be not performing for a long time. I went to a school in 2005, which was a terrible school, and I actually went back there in 2022, and it's still a terrible school, and no one's done anything about it. Versus in Singapore, the changes happen in weeks, not months, and there's a sense that, every day that a school continues to not be performing is a day that child is never going to get back. And these are big schools. And I remember an official in Singapore saying to me, why would I keep a teacher or a principal in place for a single day if I'm harming the future of thousands of children by doing so? And so it's that kind of mindset. And I think the kind of converse of why many other countries haven't improved, partly they haven't been following the evidence about policies, although that's changing a lot now. Partly they've been investing far too much in class size reduction, which is we've discussed, counteracts all the other good things you're doing. They haven't been aggressive enough in getting teacher training to be a lot more practical. Although again, there are plenty of good examples now of places that are doing that. And then there hasn't necessarily always been this willingness to take really difficult decisions in the course of a reform.
That's so fascinating, and how we could basically, improve that with the struggles to improve those schools. And you talk about the fourth thing is we know how to do it. There are many things which school systems and the people who work in need to get the right order to make sure that every child is able to learn. In my journey, it was difficult, Fenton. It was like really difficult to learn in different ways, because first of all, I come from different cultures, and my learning, ways, I got to visual learn, and I got to listen, and not just the normal way, and that right teacher, and the teacher is from a different city, and it's a different culture, and the person is teaching. So it's all these factors. Can you please expand on number 4? And how could we actually get that?
I shouldn't say that it's, teaching is not an easy job, and particularly, in difficult circumstances, there is a lot that teachers need to do, and it's hard work. That said, I think there is now, and of course, there are still lots of things we don't know about what constitutes good teaching or what constitutes good school system structures. But there is now, I think, a lot of evidence about how you, both at the kind of micro level about what works in classrooms from a teaching perspective, and what works in terms of teaching approaches, and then also what works at a policy level. So I think a lot of the future is about really following that evidence, combined though with, as we were talking about, this kind of political will and good management and leadership.
And having the right values and skills. You talk about, having fewer but better teachers, maybe, higher salaries, getting the right people to become teachers, ensuring that every school has effective leadership, that's, setting high standards and measuring whether they are achieved. How do we really, set these high standards that we actually want in schools and measure them? How do we do that? Can you expand on that?
One is obviously examinations and assessments. Everyone who's been to school knows that a common question is this going to be on the test? And if it's not going to be on the test, you can go back to sleep. What is examined is critical. And what you see lots of school systems is they said, we want a curriculum that is all about creativity and problem solving and the application of skills, but the test is still about rote memorization. And so you're still incentivizing everyone to focus on rote memorization or just basic skill things. And if you can, though, change your assessment to be more focused on the skills that you want and set a high standard for what you want, you're going to re-incentivize the whole system in that direction. Obviously, you have to be careful about that because you have a wide range of abilities of students. If the test is too hard, then people are just going to be demoralized. But there are ways you can structure an assessment system to counter that. And then similarly, again, school reviews. So a team often of experienced teachers or principals visiting another school to look at how it's performing and then make an assessment. That assessment has to be one that is about helping the school, not just punishing it for being bad, but kind of having again, high standards there. And what you see if you, there's a whole literature now, and we know a vast amount about school failure and schools that aren't performing. And almost a uniform characteristic of those schools is that people have low expectations, and the parents, the students, and the teachers, and often the principal have sort of said, this is hopeless, and they've kind of given up. And the first step in turning around a school that isn't working is to reset the expectation around a high standard of performance.
That's so fascinating. Fenton, I was speaking to a couple professors from Yale or Harvard, and I was just talking about different ways of learning and having these standards and accountability. And some of them said, they have learning disabilities, people that had ADHD or any other kind of learning disabilities, but, they're not really disabilities. They're more of actually good things to have because you are smart in other ways and you learn in other ways. With students that, let's say they have some sort of disability of learning based on how they listen or how they see, or they're different learners. So what would you say to that? What's really happening in the 21st century around different ways of teaching for the kid to actually understand and comprehend the information?
One interesting phenomenon, I think, in education is that, and one thing that has really benefited, or the focus on special needs education has really benefited the system, is when you have children who have special needs, everyone agrees that each one is going to need a kind of custom plan of how they're going to learn or how they're going to be taught. And what I think a lot of people start to realize is that's true of everyone, that, all learners are, have different strengths and weaknesses and interests and so on. And that you need to be personalizing learning. You can't do that all the time, but as much as possible for different learners. So that sort of personalization of learning is, I think, an important part of what's happening. And one interesting thing at the moment is technology makes that much easier to do, or at least can be very supportive of that process, because, both in terms of supporting teachers by giving them better information about how their students are doing, but also often, obviously, the experience of learning things on an app can be very personalized through technology. Obviously, you can't teach everything through an app, but you can teach some things. So I think one of the interesting opportunities at the moment is using technology to try and improve learning. And if I can make a reflection, if you think about what banks look like in the 1960s and then what banks look like today, they've been completely reformed by technology. Like, I don't know when the last time I went to a bank branch was. Everything is online and an app and so on. Versus if you look at schools, a lot of schools in 2022, if you walk into a classroom, it kind of looks like it did in 1960. And to the extent that people are using technology, it's using electronic whiteboards instead of blackboards, but the teaching is actually kind of the same. I'm exaggerating a bit, that there hasn't been than that. But the point is, I think there's in the way that technology has transformed almost every other sector of the economy, in education, in lots of places, the use of technology has been relatively limited. The cause of that is obviously the pandemic, where suddenly a lot of learning was forced online, and that, I think, has prompted quite a bit of innovation in this space. But I think there's still a huge technology opportunity linked to that idea of how do we personalize learning experiences for everyone.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, just as we segue away from these different topics that we just discussed, I wanted to ask you, based on the name of the company and the website and the meaning behind it, Acasus, how did you choose that name? How did that name become real? Because the meaning behind it is just so fascinating, meaning inspire, desire, like efficiency, self, all these different things. How did you guys choose it?
To be honest, it was a difficult choice. Coming up for a name for a company is never obvious. And at some point I had to fill the forms and make a decision. It comes from the Latin phrase acasus, which actually normally was used in the context of a casus belli, which legally was a legitimate reason to declare war, which has both the right connotations of we're going out to try and change the world, and perhaps a negative connotation in terms of we're not trying to do it right. But yeah, it literally means for a cause or for a purpose, and a casus belli was a just cause. So that was the idea.
That's awesome. And, talking about the best practices with the company, because you guys, more of what you guys do and how you guys guide and help and improve schools, But not just schools. You guys work with other, sectors between the data and analytics, implementation and support, leadership and management, school improvement, software engineering, strategy development, all these things that actually, these are things that support schools. Is that right, Fenton?
Yeah, most of our work is more at the kind of, if you like, ministerial level. So we tend to be working not with individual schools, although one of my favorite ever projects was when we were working with a group of school leaders in Peru to help improve their leadership, which was an amazing experience. But most of our work is more working with ministers of education or the kind of next one or two layers to help them think through how they're going to change the system. Because at the end of the day, if you fix in one school, we know how to do that, and that's relatively easy. The challenge if you're a minister of education is, how do I fix 10,000 schools, or how do I fix, in the biggest system I've worked with, 65,000 schools? And so a lot of our work is about how do you, if you're a minister of education and you're saying that you're going to improve schools, what you're basically saying is, I'm going to change what's happening during those 1 million minutes in, say, 10,000 schools. And you then need a system that's going to connect that ministerial direction down to what's happening in individual schools. And so our work is mostly about, how do you put in place that chain of systems that's going to allow a political pledge to improve education to actually make a difference in a supportive way to schools and teachers, and ultimately, obviously, students.
That's fascinating. The book that you wrote, How Good Policies Produce Better Schools, was written around like 13, 14 years ago. And if you wrote that book again, what would you say? Different, or add more information for the 21st century as we're going into 2023? What would you add to it? What would you say different? What would you improve for the next generations that are, becoming?
At the time, both the book and my work at that point were very focused on what are the right policies to improve schools. And the book was an attempt to summarize, here's what we know about how you improve schools, and to make it the sort of book that a minister of education who'd just been appointed could get through in a single evening before their first day of work, and go in knowing, here's the evidence about what we should do. I think the last 14 years have taught me that the difficult bit is actually getting it done. You can come up with the policy on paper, but how do you actually, make change happen? And so I think if I had the time, I'd love to write a second book, which is about how you make change happen. And okay, you've got your policies, how are you actually going to implement them? And then the third book in the series would be about the future. And so the original book was a summary of what we already know, but we also know that the future of education needs to go well beyond what we already know works. And we just talked about technology. We talked about curriculum and the need to have curricula that are ready for the 21st, if not the 22nd century. We've talked about the things around structural design of schools. Like, most schools, if they've got 100 students and 5 teachers, they divide it up and say 20 students in each class, and off you go. That's not, for instance, how a hospital works. A hospital has different specialists. Some patients need more care than others, and so on. And so how do we rethink, for instance, the organization of schools to have more adaptive models? One of the best schools I ever visited was in a very, very challenging area where it was an area of a big city where a lot of refugees and asylum seekers first arrived. And so they had lots of children who needed a lot of extra help. And what they decided to do is take they have 3 classrooms in each grade. So 3 grade 1 classrooms. And instead of having 3 classrooms, what they merged them into was 1 big classroom with 60 children and 3 teachers all in the same room.
Wow.
And that meant that during the course of the day, they could have times when one teacher was teaching 50 children and the other 2 teachers were working with 2 groups of 5 to give them some intensive help on something. They could have different groupings for different subjects. So for mathematics, there'd be one group working with one teacher based on ability, but then when it came to English, they divide the group up differently between the 3 teachers and so on. So these kind of much more innovative models for how you organize schools, I think, are interesting. So the third book, if I had time to write it, which I wish I would be about the future of education and what is it that we need to do next.
That's so exciting. Are those books will be coming out within a year, 2 years, so that we can actually approach it?
I'd love to have time to write books. My day job is pretty busy. One day.
One day. It's so much value that you have given in this interview and so many nuggets. I hope everyone that's listening to this actually, I think we need to re-listen to the things that Fenton talked about what are the problems, first of all? What are the solutions? How could we improve? But also understanding the change and how do we adopt and consistently improve our educational system, which is fascinating to me because as a kid going through school, it was difficult from different areas of life between culture-wise in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, to the United States. And the ways I learned are completely different. So I'm very, very excited for the future and for our next generation. And that being said, I just want to end with this because, if anyone wants to, know more about Fenton's book, you can just go online and just type in lesson learned, how good policies produce better schools, and you will find it. But at the end of the book, the book explores each of the themes. It argues the right policies combined with excellent delivery and can make every school a great school, help every teacher become an effective teacher, and ensure that all children receive the 1 million minutes of excellent schooling they deserve. But in the beginning, what you said in the beginning in the interview, you said, actually, the first 100 minutes are so important because of the subconscious mind, which is the part that is the foundation, the basics. That being said, man, where can people find you?
First, I was just to say the book is on our website and it's free to download.
Perfect.
Download the PDF. I'm all over the world working with different governments, mostly in the developing world, but sometimes elsewhere. And you can find us on our website as well and learn more about what we're doing and get in touch.
That's awesome. And you guys have a new website coming up very soon with more information. And if anyone wants also to see the PDF on, the book, it'll be in the link down below. We'll put that there for you and also the website of the company. That being said, thank you so much, Fenton. This was an awesome interview. And I can't wait for that new book, those 2 new books to come out because people need to hear it.
Excellent. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. So thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Absolutely. It was so much fun.